6 million young British men served king and country during the First World War. They were the Tommies, the nickname for the Army's ordinary soldiers. Almost 1 million of them never returned from the battlefield. In the 90 years since the armistice, time has whittled away at the survivors. A private soldier from Somerset, Harry Patch, became the very last Tommy who actually fought in the trenches of the Western Front.
We live today as we did in the trenches. 1 hour to the next.
Harry and a handful of other veterans were our last links, not only to the Great War, but to the Victorian era into which they were born.
I think I've been very, very fortunate to have been able to see this world progress as it has in all that time.
In this final chapter, we continue their stories, from the slaughter of 1917 through the 20th century to the present day.
We've got a nice big car with plenty of room.
In November 2005, the 107-year-old Harry Patch began a journey back into his past with his 94-year-old companion, Doris Whitaker. For most of his working life, Harry was a plumber. But now, he was to receive an honorary degree from the University of Bristol in the same building he had helped to construct 80 years ago.
Bristol.
Like all the surviving veterans, Harry's life after the First World War was scarred by painful memories of trench warfare.
I tried for 80 years to forget it. I can't.
He was being honored because of the wartime experience that he'd buried for so long.
It is my privilege this afternoon to introduce Mr. Harry Patch, a native of the county of Somerset, a veteran of the Great War. He is 107 years old. By 1917, when Harry Patch joined his regiment, many of the major battles of the Great War in which the British Army was engaged were over. One was yet to come, Passchendaele, and Harry Patch was in the middle of it.
Passchendaele was the defining moment in Harry's life. More than 300,000 men died in the mud. Harry almost lost his life there. One night, he and his comrades in his Lewis gun team were returning from the front line.
When the shell burst, I saw the flash. I went down. How long I stayed there, I don't know.
Harry was badly wounded. 3 of his friends were killed.
There was nothing ever found of them. I was lucky.
By the authority of the University of Bristol, I admit you to the degree of Master of Arts, honoris causa.
The Battle of Passchendaele was the end of Harry's war. He came home to recover from his wounds.
Harry. What first persuaded you to join the army?
I was conscripted.
Like many of his generation, Harry at first didn't question why they were fighting, but his views changed after his comrades were killed.
War is simply a license for murder and nothing else. It's organized murder.
On November the 11th, 1918, after 4 years of slaughter, the guns finally stopped. But for many Tommies conditioned to wartime military discipline, peace opened up a world of frightening uncertainties.
How can I describe it? Sort of helplessness. What future? What do we do next? What do we do next? We had to wait to see what we're going to do next.
Arthur Hailstrap, then aged 20, had survived 2 years in the trenches. Like many Tommies, his health had been undermined by the grim conditions. But now he faced a threat as deadly as the German guns. They called it Spanish flu.
After about a week waiting for orders, I became ill. My corporal was very worried, and he called the infantry corporal, and the corporal called the sergeant, and he was worried, and the sergeant called the sergeant major, and the sergeant major called the major, and the major said, "Oh," he said, "I don't know where the nearest medical unit is, and if I did, it wouldn't be in time." He said, "Fill him up with rum and let him take his chance. He's got Spanish flu." And I remember taking rum, and that's all I remember. And the next thing I remember was, I said to my corporal, I could just see him, I said, "Could I have a cup of tea?" And he said, "My God," he said, "we thought you were dead. You've been completely away from us for 3 whole days." And from that moment, I was better.
Arthur was lucky. By 1919, Spanish flu had claimed tens of millions of lives. Harry Patch also escaped the deadly virus, but he had to endure a whole year recovering from his war wounds. His blue uniform marked him out as one of the many thousands of recuperating soldiers. It also gave him free entry to the local cinema. Harry, accompanied by an Australian friend known as Digger, went to see a film called The Grey Ghost.
You could see the villain was just going to shoot the heroine, and you could see the hammer going back. Now Digger, unbeknown to us, took a paper bag, blew it up, and when the hammer went back, bang. Everybody in the theatre screamed. We got thrown out for causing a panic. We never saw the end of Grey Ghost.
Getting thrown out of the cinema changed the course of Harry's life.
These 2 girls were coming down from a cinema, and I knocked one over. They were going for the same bus as we were. I took her home, and I arranged to meet her the next night.
When Harry returned to hospital after a relapse, his new girlfriend Ada was a regular visitor.
Our friendship had grown into something far deeper than friendship.
Harry married Ada later that year and returned to life as a civilian. But millions more Tommies were still in uniform, Many of them, like Arthur Hailstrap, were sent to Germany as part of an army of occupation.
Returning German troops are disarmed and disbanded by Soldiers' Council. The Kaiser has abdicated and left the country, leaving behind a defeated nation and the threatening shadows of a civil war.
But he wasn't prepared for the conditions he found in a country starved into submission by the naval blockade.
I was billeted in a house with 2 elderly Germans and a young girl. And these Germans were starving. I was giving them all my chocolates and biscuits and things I could buy from the NAFE.
Arthur was about to discover the depths of their desperation.
These elderly people had offered their young girl to me, and I didn't want her. I told her that I'd got a girl at home. It did shock me, because I didn't want her at all. I resisted her. They didn't care. They were so hungry.
In February 2006, Claude Schulz, a naval veteran of the First World War, attended the opening night of an exhibition of war paintings with his granddaughter Jennifer. At the centre of the show was a portrait of Claude. It was painted from a photograph taken during the First World War, when he was just 15.
What do you think? Can you remember?
I can't remember that particular day.
No.
But I remember that time, at that time of my life.
Yes. You were so young.
I went straight into the Navy.
That's
I
right.
never had a job anywhere.
The painting reminded Claude of the 6 months he spent after the war at Scapa Flow in the Orkneys, guarding 74 ships of the interned German fleet. In June 1919, the German commander decided to scuttle his ships when he read in The Times that the fleet was to be handed over to the Royal Navy. On June the 21st, Claude was on board HMS Revenge, preparing for torpedo training.
We had the torpedo in the tube all ready to fire, and the ship was on a firing course, and suddenly the captain's ceasefire gong rang. Everybody hears it. Panic. We could tell by the vibration of the ship that we were increasing speed, and we said, oh, we're shoving on speed. There's a panic on somewhere. We thought it must be in Scapa, where the Germans are. As we went through the entrance, we could see the German ships. Some of them had sunk, and others were going over and sinking. We could see ships going all over the place. And we said, well, thank Christ for that. We've been up here nearly 6 months waiting for our war service leave. Now we'll go down home and get our service leave. The bastards are gone.
For Claude, the Navy offered security.
You grew up in the Navy.
That's right, yeah.
And the Navy was like
my life,
it was
yeah,
like your family.
Yeah.
And you got very close.
I lost my mother when I was about 4, I think. I can just remember my mother only. That's all. She died when I was about 4.
By the end of the war, his father was also dead.
His family broke up so young, and he was only a little boy when his whole family split up.
It's Mary.
I think the Navy, in fact, took over the role of family for him for many years.
Like Claude, Sandy Young lived in Perth, Australia. In 2006, Sandy celebrated his 106th birthday.
Blow the candle out.
How does it feel to reach the age of 106?
Oh, well, it feels it's just the same as any other age.
Sandy had served as a wireless operator on the Western Front in 1918. But when he returned to Britain, he found that the Tommies who had once queued to enlist were now on the dole. In 1920, Sandy graduated as a chemist in a country with 2 million out of work.
Tried everywhere for a job then, but nobody seemed to want chemists. And there was an advert saying a young unmarried chemist required for a tannin extract factory in the outer town.
For 4 years, Sandy worked for this British-owned company in Argentina. He then moved halfway across the world to work in Borneo. Despite the depression at home, Britain was still kept afloat by a buoyant trade with its colonies. And the Royal Navy still seemed to rule the waves.
The nice girls love the sailor, all the nice girls love the town, for there's something about a sailor, for you know what the sailors are. Free and easy, nice and breezy, he's the lady's pride and joy. He falls in love with Kate and Jane, and he's off to sea again. Ship ahoy, ship ahoy.
At the age of 105, Bill Stone still attended the annual reunion of the HMS Hood Association. Bill served in the Royal Navy in the last 2 months of the war.
2 weeks before I was 18, I got a letter from Exeter to go be medical examined. It was conscription then. When you were 18, you had to go. So they sent for me to go to Exeter to be examined. I caught the next train to Plymouth and joined the Navy. I beat them to it.
By 1924, Bill was a stoker on the battle cruiser Hood. Fast and lightly armoured, she was the symbol of Britain's naval supremacy. That year, Hood was part of a Royal Navy squadron sent round the world to fly the flag for Britain.
It was called the Empire Cruise, but they called it the Empire Booze. We went all around the world. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, everywhere. Thousands and thousands of visitors would come on board. We were top of the world. We had an empire then. We haven't got an empire now.
In 1924, as millions of men faced unemployment, Harry Patch was lucky enough to get work constructing the last great Gothic building in Britain, Bristol University's Wills Building. It was here, 81 years later, that Harry would receive his master's degree.
Harry, I don't know if you can see, but these are pictures when it was being built.
Yeah.
Is this how you remember it?
Yeah.
Now he could complete the plumber's apprenticeship that had been interrupted in 1916 by the war.
He used to call me Darky. My hair was black.
While working on the tower, Harry faced a threat almost as deadly as the guns on the Western Front.
Heavy thunderstorm broke out, and we went inside, out of the rain. The foreman plumber, with a steel knife in his hand, stood. took a knife out of his hand, and he never used his right arm for 3 days after. That was the nearest I've ever been to being struck by lightning, and you could smell it, sulphury in the air.
Many of the Tommies who had returned from the war hoping to find a land fit for heroes were disappointed. The economy, driven by coal and heavy industry, was in crisis. 1 million miners were forced to accept reduced wages and extended hours. In May 1926, a general strike was called, and the country came to a standstill. Claude Schulz was part of a naval detachment sent to ensure essential supplies kept flowing through the ports.
We were taken to South Wales, Cardiff. There were a lot of merchant ships there, and we were told that you are responsible for the safety of those merchant ships. If there's any trouble at all, you'll be the ones to go and square it off, settle it. We had rifles and ammunition, of course.
Men who had fought for their country now faced the prospect of having to fire on their old comrades. Servicemen were sent out to keep essential services going.
We sent stokers all over England. They went down into the mines and ran the pumps to stop the mines from flooding with water and becoming unusable. They ran trains, special services for food. We were at Cardiff for, I think a couple of weeks. That strike went on, and we used to arrange a football match. We'd have a football match with the local teams every day. There was football matches on every day. They would be strikers, I think. Yeah, a lot of them. Yeah.
After 9 days, the strike collapsed. In the turmoil, Claude decided he'd seen enough of the faltering old world and decided to look for a better life in the new. He swapped the Royal Navy for the Royal Australian Navy. Much of his scattered family had already emigrated, and Claude was about to start a family of his own.
I saw 2 girls leaning over the rail looking at the white cliffs of Dover. And I was in uniform, of course, and I sidled up to these 2 girls, and one of them walked away. And I walked after her. That was my wife. She said to me afterwards, "Why did you walk away from that other girl that I was with, looking at the cliffs of Dover?" I said, "Well, because I fancied you, not the other girl." She said, "She's better looking than I did." I said, "Well, that's only you of you, love."
I feel very proud of both of them. They're the ones that left England. They had the guts. They are, like pioneers. And there they both were at the tender young age to go then on a boat to Australia. And I think it's just amazing, I mean, travellers, Australian young people travel, and we love to travel. But back then in the 20s, it's pretty colossal.
After the First World War, Alfred Anderson came home to Perthshire to join his father's carpentry business. In 2005, he celebrated his 109th birthday. He was still living independently. His friend, the Reverend Neil Gardner, was a regular visitor.
Hello. It's only me. What are you doing today?
I was looking for what is this?
What's that? Oh, this is some of your press cuttings. That's a good one.
Alfred had outlived all his contemporaries. With the help of family and friends, he was fighting an honourable battle to keep loneliness at bay.
If you're not going about meeting people, you are frustrated. But if you're sitting in the house all day, what a life. No. We wouldn't recommend it to anybody.
And there's the oldest photograph that you've got. That was the one before you went to France, wasn't it? That's the one I've seen before.
That was
1914.
Yeah.
You were just a boy.
Just a boy. And now I'm an old boy.
Now you're an old boy. Yes, you are.
I'm a wee bit chatting. Passes the time.
Alfred had been seriously wounded by a shell in 1915.
Head in the back of the neck. Where it sores now.
The wound may have saved his life because he never went back to the trenches. Alfred Anderson died in November 2005 after a short illness. His friend, the Reverend Neil Gardner, conducted the funeral.
He represented a human side of the First World War. Here was a man who could remember vividly setting out for France in the autumn of 1914 and what life was like in the trenches, and it somehow brought it alive. And we have all been reminded through his memories of how it was just the ordinary men from the local communities who set off, not having a clue, I suspect, what they were going to face.
Our last link with the British Expeditionary Force which left to fight in France in the summer of 1914 had finally gone. Alfred Anderson and his generation had hoped that this great conflict was the war to end all wars. But by 1938, a new threat was emerging.
I remember Chamberlain coming back, waving a piece of paper. Peace in our time. 12 months later, we were at one another's throats.
When war was declared in September 1939, Bill Stone was chief stoker on the minesweeper HMS Salamander. In May the next year, Salamander was ordered to Dunkirk. 400,000 British troops were trapped on its beaches. The Germans had control of the skies, and it seemed as if they had the British at their mercy.
Bombed incessantly. The ship got hit several times. And some of the soldiers came aboard, so with no clothes on, they was in the galley. They was in awful mess. There was one man in the boat that bones out through his trousers, and I was holding onto the boat and the ship went ahead and broke. I couldn't hold the lot, and he just disappeared. I was on deck with a rifle firing at the Jerry's, was so low. The sister ship is about 100 yards away, about 200 soldiers on board. It was bombed, it just disappeared, all killed. And I said, God help us. The German submarine fired a torpedo at us, thinking that we were a destroyer, but we were minesweeping. The torpedo just went underneath us. I remember the coxswain and AB, I was on the quarterdeck, they was midship, out of their ears waiting for the torpedo to explode, but it just went underneath us and away. How lucky can you be, eh? 5 times I did those trips.
Bill's extraordinary luck held out for another 65 years. He died in January 2009. During the Second World War, many of the Tommies were too old to fight, but they still wanted to serve. Harry Patch joined the volunteer fire service and was put in charge of his own fire engine.
We had some amusing times in the fire service. We used to keep the trailer pump in a stable belonging to the vicarage. That's it. That's the vicarage.
One favourite trick was to leave the car in reverse overnight.
Number 2 crew, they go in.
Okay, where you go?
Start the engine, press the clutch. Still reverse gear, back. Now wall out the garage.
But Harry's Second World War wasn't just Dad's army. The Tommy, who had been injured by a German shell 20 years before, was again at risk from enemy fire.
So you've been up this hill a few times then?
Yes.
In 1942, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to smash Britain's cultural heritage. The targets were supposedly chosen from the Baedeker guidebook. Georgian Bath was second on the Nazi hit list, along with Exeter, York and Norwich.
This is where he dropped a bomb, direct hit, over here.
It looks like where the Bear public house is was completely knocked out.
Yeah.
It must have been a real mess here, Harry.
It was.
But the German sortie that caused so much damage wasn't the end of it. They came straight back. As Harry was putting out the previous raid's fires, he was caught out in the open.
Came down the Wells way, machine gun. I died under the bomb. Best place. If I had a Lewis gun, I'd have brought him down.
Tommies who had hoped never to experience war again found that there was no peace from the bombs and bullets.
The only fear I've ever experienced is when I've been in the Second World War, when I was in bed at night and I listened to the planes coming over and the shells dropping, the bombs dropping all around me.
Arthur Hailstrap was staying in London during a heavy bombing raid.
I went out in the morning, about 5 o'clock. I came across a young girl, and I said, where you were going at this time of day? And she said, oh, I've been driving an ambulance all night. And she was quite calm. I'd been in bed all night, absolutely shivering with fright at all these bombs coming down.
Arthur, who had been a wireless operator during the First World War, had worked in communications in peacetime. He was recruited by British intelligence and soon became Chief Signal Master in the Special Operations Executive, Churchill's secret army.
Happiest time of my life was the Second World War. I was in charge of a unit and I had women to control, and it was lovely to say to a woman, you'll do this or do that, and they would say, yes, sir. Whereas at all other times I said, yes, mum, to my mother, and yes, ma'am, to my wife. It was quite an experience to be able to say, do this, yes, sir.
These women were unsung heroes of the secret war. They were trained to receive coded signals from Allied agents.
I get them ringing up to me. One rang me up last week and said, this is Gwyneth. I said, well, Gwyneth who? Oh, she said, I was one of your little radio operators during World War II.
But the most difficult part of his job was to instruct those radio operators, mainly women, who were to be sent behind enemy lines.
I suppose I trained people of every nationality in Europe and across the world. And I made plans for them, signal plans and that sort of thing.
Arthur taught some of the great British spies of the Second World War. His signature appears on the training reports of one of the most famous and glamorous of all the agents, Noor Khan. She was eventually captured and tortured by the Nazis. She was executed in Dachau concentration camp. It weighed heavily with Arthur that he'd sent so many women to their death. He was no longer on the front line himself, but his only son, 20-year-old John Philip, was a flying officer in the RAF. In spring 1945, his plane crashed and he was killed. Arthur and his wife and their daughter were together when the terrible news arrived.
I'd been on leave with my son 2 days previously. He was killed 2 days after I saw him. We were together. And I was on leave from my unit for a week. And when I told them what the telegram contained, they clung to my line and they rolled about like this, just like that. And I knew that I had to contain my emotions so that I could look after them. That's my greatest memory.
Every Remembrance Day from then on had a double poignancy for Arthur.
It's one for John Philip.
Put it in the pocket.
Arthur Hailstrap outlived his son by 60 years. He died in April 2004.
Scottish River in 5 letters.
Clyde.
An Arab ruler. Arab ruler in 4 letters, beginning with E.
Emir.
At the outbreak of war, Sandy Young was still working as an industrial chemist in Borneo. It had been a privileged existence for Sandy, his wife and their young son, Alan.
My mother and myself, at a rather young age. A very young age. This would be in Sandakan, North Borneo. Well, Dad was sort of mainly, working at the factory. There would have been an armour looking after me, then there was I think a cook and a boy, so there were a couple of servants there. And then there was a gardener.
It was a very pleasant place, Sandakan. We had our own club and all that sort of thing. We played tennis to start with. It was several years before they started a golf course there.
Me looking like a girl.
Your mum was allowing for growth, love.
Then in December 1941, Japan attacked America and Britain in the Far East. Sandy decided to send his wife and Alan to safety. They left just before the Japanese overran northern Borneo.
I'm sure I can remember Dad sort of standing on the end of the jetty as the ship pulled out. Not very many other people around, just him.
And I didn't know how far they had got. You see, I was left in Sandakan, but I wasn't 100% sure that they had got to Australia.
For more than 2 years, Sandy didn't know whether his family had survived. He was held in one of the infamous Japanese internment camps. The guards treated prisoners with constant brutality.
They reckoned I wasn't working hard enough, and they gave me a slap. The usual punishment was a slap on the face, you see. If you walked past to go out of the camp, you had to go past a guard post, and if you didn't salute the guards, you were liable to get a slap, you see.
It's amazing, isn't it? what they can do today.
In Australia, Claude Schulz was now a naval explosive expert. He spent much of his war blowing up Japanese mines. Claude, who had witnessed the scuttling of the German fleet after the First World War, now had to prepare the explosive to sink the Australian fleet in the event of a Japanese invasion.
I had to destroy all the shipping in Fremantle Harbour, putting a depth charge in the hull of each ship moored alongside the wharfs in Fremantle. We feared a Japanese invasion here during the war, sure. We were pretty certain it was coming.
But when the Japanese didn't arrive, Claude found another use for some of the explosives.
The frogs used to come to our front garden, used to croak. They come, walk, 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 walk. You'd hear this all night, and these kids used to complain about they'd keep them awake. So I said, I'll settle them. I'll blow them to blazes. They come tonight. As soon as that charge goes, you'll never hear another frog. I fired the charge, and the noise had hardly died down. Walk, 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 walk. You could hear them. They passed the message along all the front fence, didn't they? Yeah.
In England, Harry Patch had taken a job as site foreman for the American military camps that had sprung up all over Somerset. In 1944, these fields and valleys were crowded with thousands of American troops waiting for the order to liberate Europe. Then, one night in early June, the Americans disappeared.
They were gone. The ammunition was gone. Everything was just as they left it. The fires burning in the ranges. Herds of tea, coffee, cocoa, butter, cheese, sugar, it was all left.
Harry didn't know it then, but this army had gone off to D-Day. The liberation of Europe had begun.
Australia fell the task of the Borneo invasion, when the Japanese were shown what total war could really mean.
Sandy Young had now been interned by the Japanese for more than 2 years. He still didn't know the fate of his wife and son. His only news of the outside world came from soldiers in the adjoining camp who had made a makeshift radio receiver.
We heard from the soldiers' radio that a bomb had been dropped on Japan, and that was the atomic bomb. And the information about that soon permeated the whole camp, you see. Then we started to get food parcels and things dropped from planes flying over from Australia. And on one occasion, they dropped a parcel and it struck a man that was just coming out of one of the huts, and it killed him.
The liberation came just before the Japanese were about to send the prisoners on a death march. The atomic bomb that killed more than 100,000 people may have saved Sandy's life. 2 months later, Sandy was reunited with his wife and son Alan on the tarmac of an Australian aerodrome.
I saw Alan come galloping up the road straight up to the plane at very high speed, and that was a wonderful sight for me to see. Yes, that was one of the happiest moments of my life.
Sandy Young died in July 2007. He was 107 years old. In the decades after the Second World War, Claude Schulz retired from the Australian Navy to become a cray fisherman. For 20 years, he and his wife worked a small boat.
Whiskey, Johnny, and whiskey drove me mother mad. Whiskey for me, Johnny, whiskey here and whiskey there.
He means the world to me, definitely. He's really like a father more than a grandfather. So, yeah, he's been really fantastic in my life.
What do you think has enabled you to live so long?
Yes.
Be kind to your parents.
Yeah, there you go.
There's a good one.
Yeah, there you go.
Always tell the truth.
Always tell the truth. And grandparents?
If you want to tell a lie, tell it to some bastard that you don't like.
Claude passed his centenary as positive as ever. Until the age of 104, he still took his daily walk. He'd lost his beloved wife Ethel just 3 years before.
He's coped well with Granny dying, and she had dementia for a couple of years before she died. And we found out that he'd actually been sleeping on the floor next to her bed. He would just lie a piece of canvas on the floor and sleep on it. He wouldn't sleep anywhere else because Granny might need him.
Good. Not singly, about 5 or 6 pieces.
Yeah.
After the loss of Ethel, Claude kept himself occupied using the skills he'd learned in the Royal Navy 90 years earlier. But he found the loss of eyesight and hearing increasingly frustrating.
I've lost it now. Where's my mum?
Extreme old age was taking its toll. By the spring of 2006, the survivors of World War I had been whittled down to just 8 veterans out of the 6 million who had served.
8? You sure? 5 and 3 is 8? Well, out of 6 million. Goodness me. That's amazing, isn't it?
And you're one of them.
Yeah, well, I won't be here much longer, you know. I haven't got long to go, surely. I'm not begging for it. I don't want you to hit me behind the head with a lump of 4x2 as I go down the road.
When the boat keeled over, you know what you said?
It keel right over.
Bugger this.
I couldn't have said that.
Oh. Lord, listen.
Never heard a
You
word
mentioned
like
something
that.
about...
He's had such a remarkable life that to stay positive during all of that is just huge. The First World War, the fact that his family, his mother died or whatever happened to her, his father died, his 2 brothers, one died a year after the First World War through his injuries with being gassed.
I've had the luckiest life in the world, I reckon. If I had my time over again, I'd do exactly what I did do. Yeah. Couldn't beat it.
When Harry reached 100, he finally felt able to talk about the First World War.
Come on, take the photos.
His meeting with the German veteran Charles Kuntz was another milestone in Harry's reconciliation with his wartime experiences.
He had the same impression as me. The war is just organized murder and nothing else. How was it settled? Over an office table. Well, why the devil can't they do that before they've lost 500,000 lives?
By the time Harry had reached his century, he'd long since lost all his immediate family, including his wife and 2 sons. But when he moved into a nursing home, he found new companionship with Doris Whitaker.
Shows her temper sometimes.
God, who knows who's bossing you?
Then, in early 2007, Doris died. Harry was determined to commemorate their friendship in a way that would benefit others. He gave generously to the RNLI to help them launch a new lifeboat. In July 2007, he was invited to name the vessel at the RNLI headquarters in Poole.
Can you see that?
Yes.
The Doris and Harry.
Thank you.
How does that feel?
It's lovely.
The only question is, when are you going to have a go in it?
Why not? Doris, I see you being proud.
But there was one more memorial that Harry wanted to put in place. But this would involve a pilgrimage back to the battlefields of Belgium. A memorial to friends, long gone, but not forgotten. Harry had first travelled the route from Calais to Ypres in 1917. Millions of Tommies had marched through this landscape. Now, Harry was the very last one able to make the journey. 90 years ago, Harry had fought around the village of Langemarck. His unit had to cross the flooded Steenbeek stream under intense fire. The bridge had been destroyed, and the British had to use wooden pontoons.
And when you crossed the Steenbeek, did you cross in 5 and 6s, or did you cross
one at a time? Cut out the casualties.
And how steady was it? How steady was the pontoon?
Harry had paid for a memorial stone to honour the sacrifice and courage of the Great War generation.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honoured to welcome you here at the borders of the Steenbeek for the unveiling of the memorial to commemorate soldiers and victims of every war. I would thank Mr. Harry Patch for this monument and his permanent efforts for bringing the consequences of war under public attention.
Oh, isn't that wonderful? Do you like it?
Yeah.
You do? That's good, isn't it? I'm very pleased.
Yeah.
Next day, in the nearby town of Poppering, Harry returned to Tockage. It was a social club for soldiers resting behind the front line.
You'll just be able to sign in there. That's it. That's wonderful stuff.
There aren't so many original customers dropping in these days.
You never know. You might have been here this day. On that particular day, you might just have been in the other room or in the garden.
The garden behind Tockage became a favourite place for Harry.
But isn't it beautiful? It's so, so quiet.
'Tis now. Not when I knew it. You could hear the guns. You never knew where one was going to fall short. That was a bugger up in.
Yeah.
Harry had been to Tynecott Cemetery before, but this was an opportunity for a last farewell. Of the 12,000 graves here, 8,000 are unidentified. Harry thought that perhaps his 3 friends, killed by his side in the Battle of Passchendaele, might lie among them.
September the 22nd, 10:30 at night. That's when I lost him. That's my Remembrance Day.
You all right, Harry?
There was one more stop on his pilgrimage. Under the oak trees in Langemarck Cemetery are the graves of 40,000 German soldiers. For Harry, they were once enemies, but now they were comrades. Before leaving, Harry took some acorns from the earth.
Give me those 2 on the corner.
Back at home in Somerset, Harry had a future in mind for the acorns that he had collected in Belgium.
That's all they'll grow. I know you live today as we did in the trenches. 1 hour to the next. That's how we were, the trenches. We never knew when we went over the top if there was one come along with your number on it.
Every Remembrance Day, the nation falls silent to honor the millions of men who fought and sacrificed themselves in the Great War of 1914 to 1918. The name of Harry Patch, the very last fighting Tommy, will live on forever with them. Stories, from the slaughter of 1917 through the 20th century to the present day.
We've got a nice big car with plenty of room.
In November 2005, the 107-year-old Harry Patch began a journey back into his past with his 94-year-old companion, Doris Whittaker. For most of his working life, Harry was a plumber. But now, he was to receive an honorary degree from the University of Bristol in the same building he had helped to construct 80 years ago.
First time.
Like all the surviving veterans, Harry's life after the First World War was scarred by painful...
Causa.
The Battle of Passchendaele was the end of Harry's war. He came home to recover from his wounds.
Harry, what first persuaded you to join the army?
I was conscripted.
Like many of his generation, Harry at first didn't question why they were fighting, but his views changed after his comrades were killed.
War is simply a license for murder and nothing else. It's organized murder.
On November the 11th, 1918, after 4 years of slaughter, the guns finally stopped. Memories of trench warfare.
I tried for 80 years to forget it. I can't.
He was being honored because of the wartime experience that he'd buried for so long.
It is my privilege this afternoon to introduce Mr. Harry Patch, a native of the county of Somerset, a veteran of the Great War. He is 107 years old. By 1917, when Harry Patch joined his regiment, many of the major battles of the Great War in which the British Army was engaged were over. One was yet to come, Passchendaele, and Harry Patch was in the middle of it.
Passchendaele was the defining moment in Harry's life. More than 300,000 men died in the mud. Harry almost lost his life there. One night, he and his comrades in his Lewis gun team were returning from the front line.
When the shell burst, saw the flash, I went down. How long I stayed there, I don't know.
Harry was badly wounded. 3 of his friends were killed.
There was nothing ever found of them. I was lucky.
By the authority of the University of Bristol, I admit you to the degree of Master of Arts, honoris.
6 million young British men served king and country during the First World War. They were the Tommies, the nickname for the Army's ordinary soldiers. Almost 1 million of them never returned from the battlefield. In the 90 years since the armistice, time has whittled away at the survivors. A private soldier from Somerset, Harry Patch, became the very last Tommy who actually fought in the trenches of the Western Front.
We live today as we did in the trenches. 1 hour to the next.
Harry and a handful of other veterans were our last links, not only to the Great War, but to the Victorian era into which they were born.
I think I've been very, very fortunate to have been able to see this world progress as it has in all that time.
In this final chapter, we continue their story.